You're listening to sermons from La Cañada Congregational Church and Pastor Kyle Sears. Join us in person every Sunday at 10 a.m. in La Cañada for worship. You can find more information about our church online at lacañadachurch.org.
So as I mentioned, tomorrow our nation recognizes Martin Luther King Jr. and his work in making the long arc of history bend toward justice. And while he is most famous for fighting for civil rights for African Americans, particularly in the South, his attentiveness to the threat of injustice would expand his activism beyond those needs. Fighting for voting rights in a nonviolent way revealed the power of peaceful negotiations that led him eventually to decry the violence of the Vietnam War and Black Americans' disproportionate enrollments in serving. Seeing Black Americans stuck in generational poverty led him to fight for labor rights and fair housing practices. And in all of these things, what we find is that King's faith served as a driving engine to see good come to those who desperately need it. We should remember that he was an ordained minister, with his work flowing from his Christian commitments. And so this morning, we're going to read the middle part of a psalm, and what we'll find is that this middle part is the most hopeful. The part we're not going to read, though, is the bread of this sandwich, where the bread is stories of how this world is filled with injustice. The idea that this psalm is a commitment to hope that even though we might be surrounded by a wrong reality, we can find ways to overcome because we believe in a God who loves justice and righteousness. So this is Psalm 36, verse 5 through 10. Your steadfast love, O Lord, extends to the heavens, your faithfulness to the clouds. Your righteousness is like the mighty mountains. Your judgments are like the great deep. You save humans and animals alike, O Lord. How precious is your steadfast love, O God. All people may take refuge in the shadow of your wings. They feast on the abundance of your house, and you give them drink from the river of your delights. For with you is the fountain of life. In your light we see light. Oh, continue your steadfast love to those who know you and your salvation to the upright of heart. And so within this song, and made up of mostly 3 verses, the theme of this verse is how God's steadfast love is patient and enduring and sustains us even when we feel like we are running out of the energy to keep moving forward. The imagery of this psalm and this particular verse is one of abundance, how God's love extends across creation, that our eyes are unable to capture the boundaries of it. And so he says, your love, O Lord, reaches to the heavens. It stretches across the sky from horizon to horizon, never meeting its end. As far as we move, we can still see the evidence of your love around us. It is unmovable and ever present like the mountains before us. It is deep as the depths of the untamed oceans. The psalmist says, wherever there are humans or animals on the earth, we know that God's salvation and love is there. Now, when the psalm was written 3,000 years ago, the words expressed here were sufficient to capture the breadth of God's love for us. And with the advances of science since then, we have only found higher heavens and deeper oceans. The reality of microscopic creatures who are able to survive even the vacuum of space, that though unseen to us are still there. Meaning that there is nowhere that God's presence can't be known because life is there. And so imagine within this overflowing abundance of grace, the existence of what this psalm will call wickedness. And particularly the wicked who would live in a world that, though surrounded by God's love and presence, would still say that they can only see as far as their own self-interest. So self-absorbed, they lack the imagination that there might be anything beyond the horizon but what they could claim for their own. That the wicked will create a world of limitation and scarcity so that they alone can profit and succeed. The wicked would deny access that others would take and enjoy the fruit of the land before them simply because they fear that they may one day run out. The psalm will describe them as both cunning and foolish, that they are happy to manipulate others without seeing how short-sighted they are being. And so we see this in the South, where minorities are disenfranchised by politicians rather than seen as constituents with valuable insight. Or communities that have restricted Black people from buying homes in order to create a housing environment that enriches the landowners while leaving others in poverty for generations. We see this as landlords raise rents after the fires because the market allows them to. That there are wicked who count themselves as better than the rest, self-absorbed, so that they count their wealth or their power or their ambition as the only worthy reality to be recognized. What the psalm concludes is that in their own minds, they see themselves as gods, that their reality is the only reality. And so when we sing this psalm, in part, we are singing, we are not them, so we won't act like them. We are counted not as the wickedness, but as the righteous. And therefore, we won't behave as the wicked do in living within this idea of scarcity, of limitation. We won't see the world as scarce of its resources and therefore fight for our survival over and against others within God's expansive love. Instead, we will see, as the psalmist says, the wings of God's protection spread across everything and invite those who need to be covered near to us so that they too may participate in the refuge that God gives. The psalmist says that God has an unending buffet for any who would hunger. So why would we not share our food freely? We're invited to go back and get more when we need it. That God's fountain of life never ends, so bring a cup and share it with the thirsty. This is the vision of what it means to be righteous in this world. Martin Luther King Jr. chose the path of nonviolent resistance, knowing that the resistance part would invite retaliation. You see, the reality is a moral failing can be forgiven, a slip up here and there. But the system in which our hearts are corrupted and our purposes are formed towards selfishness must be dismantled. It's not simple to say, hey, I get it, I understand, let's just move on. Instead, the hope of this psalm is that God, in God's judgments, would name the realities that construct itself to change our hearts to limit God's love, would instead be destroyed so that we can see the fullness of God's grace among us. What we have seen over the last 10 days, as neighbors checked on neighbors and kids organized cleanup efforts, and food and clothes and toys and money came to people in need, proves that the system that makes us hate one another, the culture that generates fear against someone who is different from us, or compete against one another, that system is weak and dying. Because the moment need hits an entire neighborhood and community, what we find is that love becomes the instinctive response, not just among churches. I mean, what I found is that there was such an overwhelming desire to help that really our church primary response was to just aim all that good intention toward the people who needed it. And so our conference office was, for example, was supposed to celebrate and install our new conference minister, a big party for all of the churches in the Southern California and Nevada area to welcome our conference minister to our area and celebrate her installation. And instead, we said, you know, there are 150 hotel rooms that have been booked for months for this celebration, and there are other people who need it so much more. There's 150 dinners already paid for, and hungry people who need to eat. And so instead, we stepped back, and through a couple of phone calls of people that I knew, we were able to help provide a handful of people with a place to stay and a meal to eat. In the midst of all of this, as I get references from people of saying, hey, I've got a friend who, or a family member who, or my kid's teacher's neighbor, we were able to quickly respond and provide money to help them go buy an extra pair of shoes or toothbrush or dog food or whatever they might need as they find themselves losing everything. Eric and I left about 5 o'clock in the morning with some friends and went up to their place near Yosemite. We got into town about 10 a.m. I took a nap, and then I started emailing our council and our congregation and our friends that we have made over the time, and within 24 hours have begun organizing relief, not just in these micro grants to kind of cover the next day or two of need, but then emailing people and say, hey, as soon as I get back into town, prepare for a meeting. We got back last Saturday, a week ago, once the power came back on. And then 3 hours later, I had 24 people at Anderson Hall in our community talking about what does the emergency response look like. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, I wasn't there. And that's because most of the people who were not members of this church, but members of this community. People who have come to know us as the movies in the park people, or the making lunches on Mondays people, or the whatever else sort of people. The people who'd be happy to fly a rainbow flag when other churches might not. A people who would be known for our love and our quick response. That there's no time to waste while people are hungry and thirsty and homeless. And so beginning Monday, Anderson Hall was completely empty of any donations. I actually left for a meeting, but as the kids were out of school. And so Saturday night, I told Yoseb, I need you at the church at 7:30 because people are going to show up at 8 with stuff. And they began to trickle in. I left for a meeting, and I came back, and Yoseb had organized the filling of Anderson Hall with food and clothes and backpacks and luggage and toys and books. And it was the first of several experiences where I realized that 14-year-olds are a lot better at this than 44-year-olds. Throughout the week, I was just encouraged to have kids who were not required to go to school, but instead spent all day at a church moving and setting up and lifting and making spreadsheets and all sorts of things. And so within a week, we were able to get rid of everything. We've got a lot of books that's going to Avison Elementary as they restart their library from scratch. That's the last remaining emergency supplies that we've been able to gather. The next step is to provide furniture for people as they restart their lives. But over the past week, I've been able to see a mother come in with her 3-month-old and her mother, multi-generational families starting over from scratch. One of my former Cub Scouts came in, and his dad said he cried for 2 days because all of his toys were gone. We were able to get him a suitcase filled with Legos, and he beamed. A girl, probably 6 or 7 years old, found dinosaurs donated that was as big as her, 4 of them, and wrapped them in her arms and waddled out, knowing that she now had, it's like, you're going to have to get another hotel room just for these dinosaurs. People who are in a cash economy and who are undocumented, who found that regardless of their status, that they are our neighbors and that they will receive love. And then the organizing efforts of saying that we are not going to invite predatory real estate developers to come in and change the culture of a community that has long been integral to Southern California and the Los Angeles area. And so one of the things that I was most encouraged by is knowing that the United Church of Christ Disaster Relief Ministries, they told us we are rarely the first ones on the ground, but we are always the last to leave. Because their commitment is to make sure that when disaster strikes a community, that justice and righteousness become its guiding principle, that they do not simply let people who want to make a quick buck move in, but instead work with locals to help organize relief and redevelopment in a way that is sustainable and honors the character of the people there, and often the people who were the most overlooked or marginalized in those communities. They give voice to those who often don't have a voice or a place at the table. And so those are the realities that we now find ourselves in. No one planned to start 2025 this way. But what I love is that we have become a congregation that is nimble and quick on its feet and willing to say, yes, I expect nothing less. It may be that I'm, said some things, made some commitments, and then mentioned to council what those were. And the overwhelming response was, well, we can't do anything else. We have to help. We have to respond. Of course, we're going to open up our doors. Whatever it takes. And so my hope is that what we sense is that this is an invitation by God's Spirit to embody the reality of the love of God that we have known, that many people have yet to see before them. What I keep finding is people are shocked that a church would dare care for someone who is not a member of that church. And some are even maybe a little angry about it. But the reality is that when we do this sort of resistance that Martin Luther King taught us to do, what we will find is that the difficult road that lay ahead of us is always worth it. That the desire of the psalm to see God's comfort refuge spread across those who are hurting and lonely and afraid of what comes next, that they will not do it alone, that God's presence is with them because God's church is with them. My hope is that we would be the kind of people who, though we find ourselves surrounded by devastation and loss and grief, we can become a testimony to God's unfailing love. That God does not abandon people in these losses, but it is those times when God moves closest to them. And so let's pray for our communities, and let's roll up our sleeves for our communities, and let's know that it is through the sustaining power of Christ and God's love that anything and everything can be done. Amen.